Sunday mornings had always been Claire's quiet sanctuary. She brewed her coffee slowly, letting the warmth of the mug settle into her palms as the suburban neighborhood around her seemed to hum with a rehearsed normalcy, lawns trimmed, sprinklers hissing, children's laughter echoing faintly in the distance. At 32, she had curated a life that looked perfect from the outside, a respectable career as a graphic designer, a warm house, and a husband, Mark, who fit neatly into the picture with his polished charm and unshakable composure. That morning, he kissed her with an absent tenderness, murmuring something about urgent paperwork at the office, before sliding into his car and driving away. She didn't think twice. Mark often worked weekends. Hours later, while sketching new concepts for a client, her phone buzzed. The notification lit up with a text, meant for someone else. "Can't wait for tonight. Don't forget the cash." The words were brief but jagged, slicing through her calm like a shard of broken glass. Her first thought was the obvious one, an affair. The text stung, yet the phrasing didn't align with stolen romance. It felt mechanical, almost businesslike, as though intimacy wasn't the point. And in that off note, a seed of dread planted itself in Claire's chest. For the rest of the day, Claire couldn't steady her thoughts. She replayed the message in her mind, dissecting it, trying to fit it into a narrative that made sense. If Mark was seeing someone, wouldn't the message be warmer, charged with affection, filled with longing? This one was stripped of sentiment, reduced to an exchange, like arranging a deal rather than meeting a lover. That distinction unsettled her more than betrayal would have. A kind of buzzing paranoia swelled in her stomach. She noticed how the clock ticked slower, how every small household noise seemed magnified, how her house, her supposed sanctuary, felt suddenly foreign. By evening, her restlessness had hardened into resolve. She couldn't sit idle, waiting for answers that might never surface. When Mark texted her casually that he'd be working late, she felt the lie coil in her gut like poison. Slipping into a plain jacket and pulling her hair back, she followed the familiar route into the city, her hands tightening on the steering wheel as the streets grew denser, noisier, brighter. She parked a block away from his office tower, but quickly realized he wasn't there. Instead, she trailed his car further downtown, where the landscape shifted into something rawer, anonymity carved into hotel facades and alley shadows. From her vantage point near the lobby doors, Claire watched as Mark entered the dimly lit hotel, not with a mistress, but with two men she had never seen before. They were sharply dressed, but not corporate polished. There was a hardness about them, a stiffness that spoke of tension rather than professionalism. She pressed herself against a corner of the wall, peering in as the three of them sat briefly in the lounge. Moments later, she saw it, the quick, deliberate slide of an envelope across the table. One of the men pocketed it while the other shook Mark's hand with curt finality. The gesture was so smooth, so practiced, that it was unmistakable. This wasn't romance. This was transaction. Claire's breath caught, her chest constricting as though the walls of her marriage had just caved in. She thought betrayal would shatter her. Instead, she felt herself unravel at the idea that the man she lived with, shared a bed with, wasn't who she thought he was at all. Infidelity, at least, was familiar, a script she could rage against, a story countless women had lived before her. But this was darker, stranger, dangerous in ways she couldn't name. She didn't confront him that night. She drove home in silence, the quiet of the house suffocating as she waited for him to return and smile like nothing had happened. Their marriage, from that night on, became a stage performance. Her role, unwilling, was to act as though she hadn't seen the curtain lift on the truth. Before she became the suburban wife with a polished kitchen and carefully curated social circle, Claire was an artist. Not the kind with gallery shows or patrons, but a young woman who carried a sketchbook everywhere, smudged pages filled with portraits of strangers, half-finished landscapes, and the kind of raw creativity that breathed life into ordinary moments. But art, as her mother used to say, didn't pay the bills. Claire's childhood had been defined by instability, overdue rent notices shoved under doors, Nights of eating toast for dinner when her mother's part-time job couldn't stretch far enough, the constant anxiety of losing what little they had. When Mark entered her life, steady, successful, with a calm certainty about the future, he felt like the antidote to chaos. He didn't just offer romance, he offered safety, the kind of stability her younger self had ached for. She traded in her sketchbook for graphic design, practical, marketable, and let her dreams recede into the background. With Mark, she thought she'd built a fortress against her past. But safety came with a cost, and she wouldn't realize that until much later. On the surface, their marriage sparkled. A charming suburban home with freshly painted shutters. Dinner parties with carefully plated hors d'oeuvres where Mark played the attentive husband, pulling out her chair, refilling her glass of wine, smiling with just the right amount of warmth. Holidays with his parents, who doted on her like she was their own daughter, reinforcing the illusion that she belonged to a family of unshakable perfection. But beneath the gloss, cracks showed themselves in whispers. Mark's need to control the smallest details, the way he insisted she dress conservatively for dinners, the way he skimmed past her questions about finances with clipped responses, the way his patience thinned when she lingered too long on her own projects instead of focusing on their shared life. His affection was always just out of reach, present enough to keep her tethered, absent enough to leave her uncertain. Naomi, her best friend since college, noticed. "He doesn't let you breathe, Claire," Naomi said once, her voice sharp with frustration. Claire brushed it off, telling herself Naomi didn't understand. After all, Mark had given her everything she thought she wanted: security, consistency, the illusion of family. Admitting the flaws meant admitting she'd built her life on a fragile foundation. Now, in the quiet of her days, Claire wrestled with a split inside herself, one part desperate to preserve the image of her marriage, the other unable to ignore the shadows lurking at its edges. Since the text and the hotel encounter, she found herself noticing small things that had always been there but never felt threatening until now. The way he came home late, brushing off her questions with vague mentions of client dinners. The unopened envelopes tucked into his briefcase. The sudden bursts of temper when she asked too much about their savings or why she couldn't access certain accounts. She started keeping a journal, hidden beneath a stack of old sketch pads, where she recorded these inconsistencies with meticulous care. It was her way of gathering proof, not for anyone else, but for herself, to combat the gaslighting effect of his charm and her own desire to believe in him. On some nights, she stared at the pages and wondered if she was losing her mind, if she was seeing ghosts in ordinary patterns. Yet, deep down, the truth pressed heavier with each entry.
Her life wasn't the safe haven she thought it was. It was a stage play, rehearsed and polished, and she had been cast as the dutiful wife in a performance she was no longer certain she wanted to keep playing. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those nights when Claire decided to cut her workday short and surprise Mark with takeout from his favorite Thai place. The house was dark when she pulled into the driveway, its silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Inside, she kicked off her shoes, the paper bag of food crinkling in her hands, when she heard it, Mark's voice, low and urgent, filtering through the closed door of his study. She froze mid-step. His tone wasn't the calm, polished baritone he used in court or at dinner parties. It was clipped, raw, laced with strain. "She can't find out. If she does, it all unravels." The words seemed to ripple through her chest, heavy and disorienting. Claire's grip tightened around the bag, her knuckles whitening. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, caught between walking away and storming in. Before she could decide, the door creaked open. Mark stepped out, his phone snapping shut with a sharp finality. His expression shifted instantly when he saw her, first startled, then quickly rearranged into weary annoyance. "Work stress," he muttered, brushing past her as though her presence were nothing more than an inconvenience. Claire forced a smile, setting down the food, but the words looped endlessly in her head. "She can't find out. Not she mustn't worry. Not I'll explain later." The phrasing was deliberate, conspiratorial. And for the first time, Claire felt something colder than suspicion, dread. The phone call gnawed at her all week, eroding her ability to dismiss it as stress. Every time she saw Mark typing on his laptop or stepping outside for work calls, her stomach twisted tighter. By Thursday, curiosity overpowered hesitation. When he left for the gym, leaving his briefcase on the living room chair, Claire's hands trembled as she reached for it. The leather was heavy, sleek, symbolic of the life he carried with such ease, and that she suddenly realized was closed to her. Inside, most folders contained standard contracts, the kind she expected from a lawyer. But at the bottom, tucked beneath layers of legal paperwork, was a locked folder labeled only with a set of initials. After fumbling with the clasp, she pried it open, her breath shallow. The contents were baffling: documents from companies she didn't recognize, vague financial statements tied to accounts spread across different banks, and lists of names paired with dollar amounts, payments she couldn't trace, people she had never heard of. It wasn't simply work, it was deliberate concealment. She felt like an intruder rifling through a stranger's belongings, her pulse hammering with every page she turned. When she finally snapped the folder shut, her reflection in the brass clasp startled her. Her face looked pale, thinner somehow, as if the truth was already draining her. The briefcase no longer symbolized prestige and success, it was a vault, and inside it lay proof that Mark's life was not just separate from hers, but dangerously hidden. That weekend, Claire tried to broach the subject carefully, too afraid of revealing exactly what she had seen. Over dinner, she asked softly, "Mark, are we okay?" Her voice trembled, but she kept her eyes steady on his. She expected deflection, maybe even an irritated sigh. What she didn't expect was the fury that flared across his face, swift and unguarded. He slammed his fork onto the plate, the sharp clatter making her flinch. "You don't get to question me, Claire," he snapped, his voice rising, harsh and final. "Stay out of things you don't understand." The air between them thickened, as though the walls themselves had closed in to trap her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Claire's throat tightened, her appetite gone, her body instinctively recoiling even as she sat frozen in place. He returned to eating as though nothing had happened, the dismissal absolute. But the words had lodged themselves deep inside her, more cutting than any insult. She wasn't his partner, she was an obstacle, a liability, someone to be kept ignorant. That night, lying awake beside him as he slept soundly, Claire understood something had shifted. Suspicion was no longer an abstract ache. It had teeth now, sharp and threatening. Fear crept into her chest, whispering a truth she didn't want to face: she wasn't living with a husband anymore. She was living with a man she didn't know, and perhaps had never truly known. The decision to hire Daniel came after weeks of sleepless nights, Claire tossing in bed while Mark's steady breathing beside her sounded like mockery. Every detail she had uncovered, the phone call, the hidden folder, the sharp outburst, gnawed at her until the weight of silence became unbearable. Daniel, a former cop turned private investigator, came recommended through a client at her design firm. Meeting him in a dim coffee shop miles from her neighborhood, she felt the unease of someone crossing an invisible boundary. Daniel was pragmatic, blunt, his questions cutting through her hesitations. "You sure you want me to dig? Because once I start, there's no turning back." His words echoed Naomi's, who had pleaded with her only days before. "Claire, he doesn't let you breathe. If you start pulling at threads, the whole thing will unravel, and maybe you with it." But Claire knew she couldn't unsee the shadows already taking shape. She whispered her agreement, sliding a folded list of suspicions across the table. Walking away afterward, she felt both lighter and heavier, the relief of action colliding with the terror of what the truth might cost her. It wasn't just her marriage at stake. It was her safety, her sanity, her identity as the woman who had built a life on the illusion of security. Weeks later, Daniel's findings landed like a storm she hadn't been prepared for. Mark wasn't simply bending rules at the firm, he was laundering money, creating entire webs of false legal clients that funneled into shell accounts tied to organized fraud. The numbers were staggering, the deceit deliberate, the danger real. Claire sat at her kitchen table staring at the folder Daniel had compiled, her hands trembling as she turned each page. Every transaction felt like a betrayal carved deeper into her chest. That night, she stood under the shower until her skin turned red, scrubbing at herself as if she could erase the stain of his lies. Hot water cascaded down her back, but it didn't cleanse, it only magnified the suffocating knowledge that every meal, every mortgage payment, every carefully chosen throw pillow in their perfect home was funded by corruption. Days later, Mark handed her a velvet box, smiling with practiced charm. Inside lay a necklace, sparkling with a brilliance that made her stomach twist. "Just because," he said, brushing a kiss across her temple. She forced a smile, but her throat tightened. The weight of the necklace in her palm felt less like a gift and more like chains, gold polished by blood money. The walls of their marriage gleamed brighter, but Claire saw the rot underneath, spreading, unstoppable. Naomi was the only one Claire could confide in, though even that connection grew fraught. They sat across from each other in Naomi's cramped apartment, the air thick with desperation. "Leave him, Claire," Naomi begged, her hands gripping Claire's like lifelines. "This isn't about love anymore, it's survival." But Claire, her voice barely a whisper, choked out the truth she hadn't admitted aloud. "If I leave, he'll destroy me. He always wins." She could already feel his presence closing in, Mark monitoring her credit cards, questioning her phone calls, commenting casually on where she had been as though he knew her every move. At first, it seemed like paranoia, but the pattern was undeniable. Each step she took toward freedom, he anticipated, reeling her back with invisible strings. Isolation became her new reality, her world shrinking until it was only the house, the routines, the smile she had to wear. Daniel's updates came through coded messages, Naomi's calls limited to hushed whispers. Claire felt herself slipping further into a cage lined with velvet, beautiful but suffocating. At night, lying beside Mark's steady, confident frame, she understood the gravity of her position. She was no longer just a wife in a fractured marriage. She was a woman trapped in a web she hadn't chosen, caught between exposing the truth and surviving the lie. And in either choice, the cost would be devastating. Daniel's voice on the other end of the line was steady, but the weight of his words hit Claire like a physical blow. The documents, the shell accounts, the shadowy firms, they weren't just financial scams. They were fronts, channels funneling money through so-called consulting businesses that masked a darker reality, human trafficking. The words seemed to dissolve the air around her. She staggered back against the kitchen counter, bile rising in her throat. The man she had once trusted with her life, the man who bought her flowers and kissed her cheek in front of his parents, was funding exploitation. She thought betrayal couldn't cut deeper than infidelity or fraud, but this revelation gutted her. Every memory with Mark now felt poisoned, his reassuring smile, his promises of safety, even the stability he offered had all been built on the backs of ruined lives. For days, she could barely move, drifting through the house like a ghost, the knowledge pressing against her ribcage until she could hardly breathe. But silence was no longer an option. She couldn't keep existing as a bystander to his crimes. The decision came with clarity, sharp as lightning. She would confront him, record everything, and finally drag the truth into the open. The night she chose to confront him, rain lashed against the windows, thunder splitting the air as though nature itself braced for the storm inside their home. Claire set her phone on record, tucking it behind a lamp, her heart hammering as Mark entered the living room. His shirt was damp from the storm, his expression irritable at first, until he saw her standing rigid, eyes blazing. "Who are you, Mark?" she demanded, her voice trembling but unyielding. He froze, then smirked, the arrogance she had only glimpsed before now unfurling in full. "I'm the man who saved you," he sneered, stepping closer. "Without me, you'd still be broke, painting in your tiny apartment. You think you survived without me?" His words dripped with contempt, each syllable slicing through her like glass. Claire's stomach twisted, but she held her ground, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You built this life on suffering." Instead of remorse, Mark laughed, a cold, humorless sound, and admitted enough to damn himself, the accounts, the laundering, the partnerships. He spoke not like a man confessing, but like a king boasting of his empire. Claire's phone captured it all, the storm outside punctuating every chilling word. For the first time, she saw him not as her husband, but as the monster he truly was. The confrontation escalated with terrifying speed. Mark's face twisted with rage when he realized her defiance wasn't breaking. In 2 strides he closed the distance, shoving her back against the wall, his hand clamping around her throat. Panic exploded in her chest as she clawed at his grip, gasping for air. His eyes burned with fury, spittle flying as he hissed, "You're nothing without me, Claire." The room spun, her vision dimming, when suddenly the front door burst open. Shouts filled the house, police, armed and urgent, storming inside. Daniel had tipped them off, timed to the confrontation. Mark's grip loosened just as 2 officers wrenched him away, forcing him to the floor. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut was drowned by his screams, venomous and desperate, "You'll regret this. You're nothing without me." Claire collapsed, her knees buckling as the adrenaline drained, leaving her trembling and hollow. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the chaos shifted into eerie silence. She clutched her throat, her breath ragged, staring at the man she once loved now dragged away in chains. Relief didn't come, only a bone-deep devastation, the truth settling like ash. She realized, in that moment of collapse, that the life she had clung to had never been real. Mark had been a stranger all along, his love a performance, his security a cage. And the deepest betrayal wasn't just his crimes, it was that she had never truly known him at all. In the weeks following Mark's arrest, Claire's world became a revolving door of police interviews, attorney meetings, and long nights staring at the ceiling. Testifying against him was both empowering and excruciating. Each time she sat across from federal agents, sliding forward the evidence Daniel had uncovered, her hands shook. The weight of her words felt enormous, enough to dismantle the man she had once promised to love. She wrestled with guilt, a corrosive voice whispering that she had destroyed her marriage, that she had betrayed him. But every time those doubts crept in, she remembered the folder of shell accounts, the bruises on her throat, and the countless unseen victims hidden behind his empire of deceit. Fear lingered, too, a constant shadow. She worried about retaliation, about him finding a way to reach her even from behind bars. There were nights she bolted awake from nightmares, convinced she heard his footsteps in the hall. Through it all, Naomi was there, bringing coffee when Claire couldn't sleep, sitting beside her during court hearings, reminding her that guilt was the language of control Mark had planted in her. Slowly, Claire began to understand, telling the truth wasn't betrayal. It was survival. After the trial began, Claire started therapy at Naomi's insistence. At first, she resisted, embarrassed to bare her brokenness to a stranger. But week by week, she unraveled her story in the quiet safety of a therapist's office, her voice faltering at first, then strengthening as she released years of silence. One session became a turning point. "I spent years thinking survival meant staying," she admitted, tears streaking her face. "Now I know survival means leaving." Saying the words out loud felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. With therapy came courage to make practical changes, too. She sold the house, a place once polished with lies, and moved into a modest apartment above a bookstore. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but for the first time, the space felt entirely hers. No hidden accounts. No footsteps she feared. Just a quiet kind of freedom. The apartment became her sanctuary, a place where she could finally exhale. She started journaling again, not to document suspicion but to reclaim her voice. And in the corner of her living room, she set up an easel, dusting off her old paints, her fingers trembling as she made her first hesitant strokes. Painting became Claire's lifeline. At first, her canvases were dark, abstract swirls of black and crimson, echoes of fear and betrayal. But gradually, lighter colors began to emerge, strokes of gold, bursts of blue, shapes that hinted at hope rather than despair. Each painting felt like a conversation with herself, a way of processing what words couldn't capture. Naomi visited often, marveling at the progress, her encouragement nudging Claire towards sharing her work beyond her apartment walls. Months later, Claire agreed to submit one piece to a local gallery's community showcase. The day she walked in and saw her painting hanging among others, her chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in years, pride untangled from someone else's approval. Standing there, surrounded by strangers admiring her work, Claire smiled, a real smile, not the polished performance she had worn throughout her marriage. For the first time, she felt whole, not because of security handed to her, but because of resilience she had forged herself. Her life was smaller now, simpler, humbler, but it was hers. And as she left the gallery that evening, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, she whispered to herself a truth she finally believed: survival was never about staying. Survival was about choosing herself. The studio was small, barely larger than the living room of her old house, but to Claire, it felt like a cathedral. Sunlight poured through the wide window, scattering across jars of brushes and tubes of paint, illuminating the unfinished canvas before her. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and coffee, a combination she had once associated with late nights in her 20s, back when art was her compass. Now, it was her lifeline. She sat at the easel, her hands steady as she added the final touches of light to the storm scene she had been working on for weeks. Setting the brush down, she reached for a battered leather journal tucked between paint-stained rags. It was the same one she had kept during her marriage, its pages filled with fears she had been too afraid to voice aloud. Flipping to an old entry, she stopped at the words, "I'm scared of losing him." For a moment, her chest tightened, remembering the girl who had written it, the woman who believed her survival depended on a man's approval. Slowly, Claire drew a line through the sentence, the scratch of the pen loud in the quiet room. Beneath it, in clear letters, she wrote, "I found myself instead." Claire rose and stepped back from the easel, her gaze settling on the finished painting. It showed a solitary woman standing on the edge of a violent storm, her figure outlined against a sky split between dark clouds and a piercing beam of light. The storm raged behind her, but her face was turned toward the brightness breaking through, resolute, unafraid. The brushstrokes were bold, imperfect, alive in a way Claire hadn't allowed herself to be for years. She hung the canvas on the wall above her desk, hammering the nail with hands that no longer trembled. As the painting settled into place, she felt something inside her settle too. It wasn't just art, it was testimony. A reminder that she had endured, not because Mark's illusion of safety had shielded her, but because she had clawed her way out of the wreckage and built something truer. She didn't need the polished facade of the suburban house, or the jewelry, or the illusion of being saved. She had saved herself. And as she stood there, framed in sunlight with paint smudges on her hands, Claire realized the storm hadn't destroyed her. It had revealed her strength. A knock sounded, pulling her from her thoughts. Naomi's voice carried through the door before it even opened. "I brought coffee," because apparently, surviving trauma doesn't mean surviving caffeine withdrawals. She entered, balancing 2 cups and grinning as her eyes landed on the painting. "Well, look at that," she teased, setting the cups down on the cluttered desk. "Looks like you finally painted yourself free." The words struck Claire deeper than she expected, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She smiled, not the polite, practiced curve of lips she had worn during her marriage, but something genuine, born of release. She stepped back toward the canvas, coffee warming her palms, Naomi's presence anchoring her in this new life. The betrayal had shattered everything she thought she knew, her marriage, her safety, her illusions. But in the breaking, she had found space to rebuild, piece by piece, into someone stronger. Claire wiped at her tears and laughed softly, a sound carrying both grief and triumph. The studio was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt alive, filled with the pulse of her survival. As the light shifted across the painting, the storm giving way to brightness, Claire understood that this was her ending, and her beginning. The screen faded, not on destruction, but on her quiet strength, defined not by Mark's lies, but by the life she had chosen for herself.